We come to Berlin, we American presidents, because it's our duty to speak in this place of freedom. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Welcome to the Fidelis Leadership Podcast, a place of learning for those who aspire to leadership excellence. Here's our host, Mike Etor.
Pleased to have Steve McMahan with us today on the Fidelis Leadership Podcast. Steve and I worked together at Kforce. Steve held a variety of sales and operational executive roles. He was a C-level officer in Kforce. Learned a lot from Steve personally. Been watching his career from afar since Kforce. He's surely been there and done that. Steve, I can't thank you enough for being here. Welcome to the Fidelis Leadership Podcast.
Mike, it's great to see you again. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yes, thank you. Well, listen, that's obviously a very brief intro. You're one of the most seasoned executives that I've had on the podcast. So for the audience's sake, who, by the way, are all leaders at various levels seeking leadership excellence, what more do we need to know about Steve McMahan?
Mike, as you know, I'm a retired executive. I'm 68 years old. I retired last year. I spent 46 years in various roles in corporate America with 4 companies, the last 40 of those in leadership positions. My first leadership role, I had 3 people I was responsible for. My last position, I had 3,000 people I was responsible for. And I worked for 19 leaders during my career. I think I learned a couple things to do and not to do from every one of them.
Well, that's a good statement. So that's the first unscripted question. I maintain that I have learned as much from poor leaders and bad leaders than the good ones. You know,
Absolutely.
Has
Absolutely.
that been your experience too?
No question about it. It's early on in my career, I got a big promotion and I got transferred to another part of the country. The guy who inherited didn't really want me. And so I'm riding into the airport to meet the new team. And I said, so any advice on, how she get started, whatever? And he says, yeah, just don't make it worse. And I thought, okay. And I bet there's some truth to that because a lot of leaders do make it worse. I try to always be one of the ones that made it better.
Yeah, just don't make it worse. I love it. Well, Steve, tell us a little bit more because I'm not really sure. I know that you were, I believe, the CEO or the president of your last company, a big healthcare related company. Tell us a little bit more about that last role because it was really the culmination of your career. What did you do? What did the company do? What was your role?
So I went there. The name of the company, CHG Healthcare, one of the most respected companies in America, privately held, multi-billion-dollar organization. And I went there as a division president, and they hired me when I was, I guess, 61 years old, which is unusual. But they had a particular division, very, very successful company with one division they had some challenges with that they thought I was well suited to address. And left there 7 years later as a group president with 5 divisions of the company reporting to me, all in healthcare staffing. They are the most respected and one of the largest healthcare staffing companies in the world. They invented the locum tenens industry. So we did staffing for physicians and other healthcare professionals.
Nice. Well, I always ask a couple scripted questions up front, Steve, and I always tell people, the metaphor I use or the example I use, if we were in an elevator and I didn't know you, I found out who you were, and obviously successful high-level executive. I only had 35 floors of a quick elevator to talk to you. I said, Steve, I'm an aspiring leader. Real quick, what's your philosophy of leadership? What would you tell me?
Well, Mike, what I'd say is this. I think for individuals, as Heraclitus said, character is destiny. And for companies, leadership is destiny. You show me a company, I'll tell you what kind of leaders they have. Show me the leader, I'll tell you what kind of a company they have. Yeah. With character, with leadership, it's not the only thing you need, but I think it's really the only thing you can't do without as an individual and as a company.
Yeah, I agree with that. In fact, I have that quote on my home wall: "A man's character is his fate." By the ancient philosopher. And I tell people when I teach it, as you know, I teach and coach. I show them a picture of an arch with the keystone. The keystone is what keeps everything together. The Romans figured it out. And I refer to character as the keystone. If you pull character out of the equation, doesn't matter how strong everything else is, eventually that arch is going to collapse.
And he said that thousands of years ago was true then. It's true now. We had a major CEO in America lose his job last week due to inappropriate character behavior. It's just, you've seen it. I've seen it. It seems so obvious and so simple, but.
Yeah. Well, one question I would like to probe a little deeper on that, relative to Heraclitus is how I say it. We don't know who the hell, how these guys said their names, but the old guys had it figured out thousands of years ago, generally. And the unscripted question, Steve, I tell people, in Mike Etor's experience, leadership at its fundamental is all about human nature. It's about, dealing with human beings and human nature. I mean, technology, society's changed, the world has changed, but human nature really has not changed at all since the cavemen. I mean, it's baked into our DNA. And I tell people, to be a successful leader, you have to want to lead. You have to love people and be willing to help them with their problems. And you have to become very adept at human nature. Greed, jealousy, whatever the case may be. Your thoughts?
Well, I agree with that completely. You go back, whether you read Heraclitus or any of the mythology, every time you see a leader fail in our current environment, you can reflect back and think of a story that's 1,000 to 2,000 years old that points to the same character flaws that causes somebody's downfall. And it is all about people. I mean, I remember working with you, and when you were put in charge of our IT operations, you had no experience in IT. And people say, well, that'll never work. He's not an IT guy. But what you were was a leader who understood how to lead and motivate and direct. And you were tremendously successful. What I eventually figured out is, and I last probably 15 years of my career, I was somebody who would be parachuted in to fix a broken company. If I could get the leadership piece right, everything else took care of itself.
Yeah.
But if I didn't get that right, everything else was just rearranging deck chairs of the Titanic.
Yeah, I agree with that. I'm assuming, I don't know if I've ever met an executive that read more than you. I know you were a voracious reader. I don't know if you've ever read a book. I'm mentioning this for your benefit, Steve. I think you'd like to read this if you haven't, but more so for the audience. There's a book by a Dr. Timothy Irwin, Irwin, and I think the title of it is Derailers. And his entire book is really these deadly sins that executives execute, commit, that derail their career. For example, the guy he had it going on, I think a Fortune 100 CEO and all that, and, doing something that you would have warned a frontline supervisor, like, look, this is against the rules. You can't do that,
Absolutely. I'm not familiar with this book. I'm going to grab it. There's one probably 15, 20 years ago, very similar thing. He had 7 deadly sins or something like that. I need examples. Dishonesty, greed, whatever. My grandmother used to say common sense isn't common. I mean, this stuff is obvious, but it still happens.
It's exactly right. Well, I always ask the timeless question up front, Steve. Leaders, born or made?
Mike, I think leadership is a combination of a craft, it's a profession, and like any other craft or profession, whether you're talking about an athlete, surgeon, or a musician, or what have you, everybody's got a certain amount of innate abilities and talents and skills. And so I think virtually anyone can become an effective leader if they put their mind to it. I think for some people, it's easier than others. For some people, it's easier to become a great musician than others, or a great writer, speaker, what have you. We all have but it's an acquired skill.
Yeah.
And so I think the answer is, while there's a little bit of a genetic component, I think great leaders are made, not born. In fact, I think some of the worst leaders I've worked with are actually some who had the DNA and over relied on the DNA and didn't dedicate to learning the craft. So they were they looked a certain way, or they spoke a certain way, or went to a certain school. They thought that made them a great leader. So
Yeah.
they skimped on the knowledge acquisition piece. They were some of the worst leaders there.
Yeah, that's my thoughts as well. I agree entirely. I agree with your analogies and your metaphors. I believe some people are just born. Mike Etor was not born with any kind of math ability, and some people are born and they just have it. I do believe some people are born with that chip in the motherboard. They've got a couple chips. Some people have none. My wrestling coach my son's wrestling coach used to say, let me get this right so I don't screw it up. He would say, hard work beats talent when talent won't work hard.
I've heard that.
And it's so true. I think it's what you just said relative to leadership. And I think you answered part of the next question. I maintain, I'm big on the term world class. And I believe, yes, I believe leadership is a learned skill. I think you agree with me on that. And I think regardless of innate aptitude, I think a person that's willing to commit and put the reps in, I think that he or she can not only become an adequate leader, I think they can become a world-class leader, not necessarily in a world-class organization. I think you can become an incredibly effective leader leading the mailroom or the loading dock or the accounts payable department. It is a learned skill. And I think it's how good you are as a leader is only really limited by your ability to work and continually learn and refine. Your thoughts?
I'd agree with that completely, really for two reasons. One, I could want to be a center in the NBA as much as possible, but I'm not 7 feet tall, so I think the kind of leadership we're talking about is something that anyone can aspire to. You don't have to be the smartest person, the tallest person, the most articulate person, the best looking person. These are all acquirable skills. So I think for that reason, I think the other reason it's true, Mike, is excellent leaders, world-class leaders, to use your term, are so extraordinarily rare that there's not that many people competing with you for the title of world-class leader. Because I think that's one of the biggest challenges in corporate life and society as a whole. There's so few good leaders out there that even if you're just adequate, people, you're the best boss I've ever had, because the other bosses I had were most terrible.
Yeah, I tell people that the bar for leadership in corporate America, unfortunately, is rather low. And so that if you are an adequate leader, you're already in the top 10%.
Well, exactly my point. That's exactly my point.
So therefore, if you seek to go beyond that boundary and really learn, your people will know that. And before you know it, you're in the top 5%.
Well, that's absolutely right. And you'll get so much good feedback, because once people see that you're an appropriately focused leader, which means you're focused on the mission and helping them achieve the mission and grow, like, people will help you lead them because they're so unaccustomed at working for somebody who will help them do that. They want you to succeed.
Yes, I agree entirely with that. Well, Steve, through your career, you've worked for, observed, mentored, trained so many leaders. Let's talk about the good ones now. In fact, that's not only the good ones, the top 10% of the best leaders you've ever seen or observed, interacted with. Are there any traits, characteristic, habits that you feel most of the very, very best leaders have in common?
Mike, I'd say 4 things come to mind. I think the first, which I've already touched on, is by definition, you cannot be an outstanding leader, a world-class leader, without strong character. It's impossible. If your people can't trust you, they won't respect you. You can't lead. It's the without this nothing thing. But again, there's so many examples where it doesn't exist. So for starters, they are people of unquestioned character. Number 2, they're focused on the mission and their people. Now, that sounds like an obvious thing, but I'm sure at some point we'll get to the opposite characteristic, which is and people who fail. But the best leaders, to me, they're focused on the right stuff.
Yeah.
It's not about them, the next promotion, what the year-end bonus is going to look like, company politics, all that baloney. They're focused on, companies entrust me with leadership of a group of men and women. What is the mission? What am I supposed to be achieving here? And how do I work with and develop and train and support my people so that they can achieve the mission?
Yeah.
So strong character. They're focused on the right stuff. Number 3, I'd say they have a bias for taking action. And, one of the biggest things that surprised me is you sort of move up in corporate life. And I've been brought into organizations that were failing. So they brought in, it's like the number of leaders who could look at the same problem week after week, month after month, and not do anything about it. It's just, it's not like you come into a place and, oh, I'm so smart, I figured something else that nobody else had figured out. That's not what's going on.
Yeah.
So a bias for taking action.
Yeah, I love it.
And then the 4th thing I would say, I'm going to expand on this a little bit, because it doesn't mean, when I talk about this, it doesn't always mean what people think I mean. Really effective leaders are outstanding communicators. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that is this. For starters, you've got to create an environment where everybody can tell the truth to each other. My first job out of college, I worked for IBM, which at the time was probably the most respected company in America. And of the 4 places I worked, it's the place I stayed the least. I was only there for 3 years. And I was very grateful for the training they gave me. But one of the things I learned there very early on is nobody was telling the truth to each other. And you couldn't tell the truth because that was being negative. And so I think for starters, the most important part of communication is establishing an environment where you can tell the truth to each other. So if you're a general, and if your field commanders aren't telling you the truth, how the hell as a general do you develop an effective strategy to fight a battle? Right? And number 2, I think you then as a leader have to listen. And as you know, I spent most of my career in sales organizations, and a lot of salespeople are big talkers but not good listeners. And a lot of times they then become, leaders, and they're not good listeners. I worked for a guy one time. They said the only time he listened to you, what you were saying, is when you were talking to somebody else. And so they're good listeners. And I think the next thing, communication, I think this is maybe, if I had to pick one thing that over the last 5 or 10 years became my mantra as an executive, is they have to have the ability to give direct, constructive feedback to their people in such a way as it becomes actionable and actions taken. And this is something that I have found, even with some of the best executives, they are not good at giving people direct feedback.
Yeah.
They're afraid to do it. They may be disappointed in the leader, but they won't say it to them one-on-one. They'll wait till they're meeting with the whole team, and they'll chew out the team, but they can't do it one-on-one. Or they do it in such a way as the leader shuts down, the recipient shuts down. So if you develop, and I developed a specific technique for this that really worked for me, but you've got to be able to provide direct feedback, because what happens is on a scale of 1 to 10, you're a 9 in terms of how disappointed you are in somebody, but you don't hurt their feelings. So you soft pedal it. So you give it to them as a 6, but they've got their defenses up, so they hear it as a 3. So you're 9. You're ready to fire them, and they think you're a 3. And then a month later, you fire them. Like, well, what the hell happened there?
Yeah.
So strong character, focused on the people and mission, bias for action, excellent communicator. If I had to pick 4, those would be my 4, Mike.
Yeah, I love them. I absolutely love them. I wanted to talk a little bit about the last one there, the communication. I do agree. That's where, in my estimation, a lot of people have blown it. That's where I've blown it on several occasions.
Me
frankly,
too.
Frankly. And so I was fortunate to come from the Marine Corps, where they were famous for one very direct feedback, and I'll dress it up a little bit like, Mike, that sucked. Don't do it again. And so I came from an environment where just get it out there. Let's go. Let's progress. Let's take action. And so I had to learn how to become more artful as an executive and all of that. Unfortunately, a lot of executives don't get that kind of, in fact, most executives get no training.
Right.
And so I'm big on the science and art of leadership. Well, the science says you got to provide people feedback. The art of it is what you just talked about, when to do it, how to do it. And if you're having a conversation, I'm going to let you expand on this, Steve. If you're having a conversation with somebody and what you're essentially saying is, you have to fix this or we're going to part ways. You're going to leave the company. You have to make that. They cannot leave that meeting thinking, well, he's displeased with them. They have to leave that meeting knowing I'm on the X and I have to do A, B, and C, or I'm going to get fired. They have to know that. And I find a great reluctance in executives to do that.
Right.
And you do a disservice to a person that you're ready to fire, except he or she leaves the meeting and they don't know that it's that serious. That's on the executive. That's on the leader. So I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, I think everything I know about leadership, Mike, involves a mistake I made along the way. And this is one of the things when I was early in my career as a leader, I was terrible. If I look back, and I'm proud of a lot of what I accomplished and what I achieved, and I've got a great track record and all that. But I think back to some of the people who worked for me early on, and whatever good I did, this was an area I was terrible at.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is that as a teenager, I had an incident in my life where I gave somebody some very direct feedback on something, and it ended up having tragic consequences. Mm. And for a long time, I was very, very reluctant, even more so than the average person, to give people negative feedback.
Yeah.
Didn't want to hurt their feelings, didn't want, just much more even than hurting feelings. But what I realized, of course, is over time, I was doing people a terrible disservice as a leader.
Yes.
I remember reading one of Patrick Lencioni's books. I think it was his first book about CEOs. There's a story in the book about a CEO, and he's got his head of marketing, and the guy's really failing. And basically, he's being challenged by a board member to confront this, and he can't do it because he basically didn't want to hurt his feelings.
Yeah.
So the board says, "Well, what did you do?" He says, "Oh, so I fired him."
Well, yes. Rather than hurt his feelings and have a tough conversation, it's just easier for him to meet with HR and go away.
Exactly. So here's what I found became very effective for me, and I've trained on this and it's worked for others. There's sort of two axes in communications. One of which is direct and indirect. So direct is, Mike, you're failing, and if these results don't change in 90 days, we're going to have to let you go.
Yeah. And
indirect is, Mike, I love you, but come on, you can do it, buddy, right? Just got to pick up. So it's direct and indirect, and the other is respectful and disrespectful. And we've all seen, people, managers who are nice or kind, and the other end of the spectrum is the guy who doesn't say anything forever, and then he just blows up and starts screaming at somebody.
Yeah. And
so if you map it out, it's a quadrant. And the quadrant I found worked for me is I would bend over very backwards to be respectful and direct.
Yeah.
And by being respectful and kind, two things happened. One, it enabled me to give direct feedback without feeling like I was being a jerk or hurting people on this or whatever. But the other thing is when I'm respectful and kind as a leader, it takes away their excuse not to listen to me. You've all had the friend who said, I went into work today, my boss reamed me out for being late. Oh, what a jerk. He said this, he said that. And then you ask the person, well, were you late? Oh, yeah. Well, have you been late before? Oh, yeah, I'm late all the time. But that's not the issue. The issue is my boss is a jerk. So, one, it helped me deliver the message. And two, it took away their excuse not to listen to it. And so once I figured that out, it's obvious to a guy,
Yeah.
you had a lot more leadership training early in your life than I did. It's so sorely lacking. I'm sure you figured this out before I did. But for me, once I figured out, so I'd sit somebody down. I'd say, Mike, I enjoy working with you greatly, but we've got a real performance issue here that you and I need to discuss. And I want to spell it to what I see as the issue, get your feedback, what I think needs to be done, tell you what the consequences of, and what I found is when you'd shoot straight with people like that, A, you got much better results, and B, it was well received. And if you did have to exit somebody, people always felt, well, okay, you didn't blindside me, you gave me a chance. And it took me longer than it should have in my career to figure it out, but eventually got to the point where it helped me become much more effective as a leader.
Yeah, I wanted to one layer deeper on this. I agree with everything you're saying. I think there's a strong bias on, especially new leaders, not to be that jerk. And,
Right.
a lot of people, one of the biggest fears of people, as you know, is public speaking.
Right.
One of the main reasons why people refuse to be promoted into leadership roles, as I've seen the data, is they know they can do it. They'd like to do it, but the thought of giving someone negative feedback and having to fire someone is so abhorrent to them. They actually don't pursue a leadership role. And so they, in a sense, they damage their family's future, as far as income and all that, because they stay in non-leadership roles. So I think and I know you agree with this. I'm talking to the young leaders out there. I want you to emphasize and reinforce, Steve, with your own experience. You're a jerk if you don't provide this feedback. And I have found that the best leaders put in a lot of prep time for a meeting like this, a lot of it, so that when they talk to the person, to your point, artfully, tactfully, respectfully, that when they leave, and maybe they have a sheet of paper that says, look, this is the expectations of your job. This is the current results. And here's what you need to do going forward. You need to do A, B, C, and D. And I'm going to help you with A. I'm going to get some training. I'm going to do this and all that. But make no doubt about it, if we don't see movement in these areas, significant movement, and you need to quantify that movement in the next 90 days, we're going to have to take action. Every time I've ever been provided with that kind of feedback, I've never been threatened with being fired, but I've been told I needed to improve, and my areas, my departments needed to improve. Every time I received feedback like that, I truly appreciated that because I had something to go on. Generally speaking, I knew something wasn't right. I was struggling or floundering or whatever. So anyway, I'm starting to ramble. I just want to make sure that you have an opportunity to talk to these young leaders. What kind of prep do you put in for a meeting like that? And at a minimum, what does the person being counseled, who's on the X, I mean, he or she's going to get fired, what do they need to leave that meeting knowing, being aware of? What do they need to know?
Well, first of all, I think you have, as a leader, to really always bear in mind how important every person's career is to them. So if you're going to have this kind of a meeting with somebody, you owe it to them to really be prepared.
Yeah.
And for starters, is you have to be able to clearly articulate what the problem is in a very direct, actionable way. Yeah, this is what's happening. Here's why it's not working. This is what needs to happen instead. Here's the time frame. Here's the deliverables. I think you really have to spell it out in black and white so there's no ambiguity. It can't be, hey, it's not happening. This isn't good enough. It's got to be as specific as humanly possible. I think they've got to know that you're committed to helping them get there and sort of what if the current state is not acceptable, what acceptable looks like and what the action plan is, deliverables, due dates, it's got to be as specific as possible.
Yeah.
Otherwise, people will just feel like, okay, they're setting me up, right? So like, okay, you give me 30 days notice. They're not really committed to helping me. They're not really going to solve the problem. This is just like a check a box with HR before they win.
Yeah. And one last touch on this, Steve. So thank you for that. I think it's very enlightening and illuminating for our audience. And I know what your answer is going to be on this, but I want to draw it out for the audience. So when you send that person away, you've done it right. He or she knows I've got to do A, B, and C. What advice would you give leaders? Look, in many cases, it shouldn't end there. You send them away knowing they've got to fix things, but you as the leader bring other resources to bear as well.
Right.
You put somebody to sit next to them, increase training, whatever the case may. In other words, provide above and beyond resources, support, and attention to help that person remediate the deficiencies. Thoughts?
Well, I'd agree with that 100%. And the one thing I'd add on top of that is I'm generally going to try and circle back with that person within 24 hours to 48 hours and just say, hey, Mike, I know we had a tough conversation on Tuesday. Yeah. That could not have been easy for you. How you doing?
Yeah.
Are you clear on what I say? Are you clear on the act? Do you have any questions? Is there anything you don't understand in terms of next steps? And so I'm just going to follow through, I think, really for two reasons. One, I want them to know that I care about them as a human being, as a leader, and genuinely concerned. And two, I want to make sure that there's no misunderstanding because, again, people have filters, and sometimes they have the ability to filter out the stuff they don't want to hear.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to make sure, I just want to make sure, because again, I think I was so bad at this earlier in my career as a leader because I wanted to be a nice guy.
Yeah.
Of course, one of the things that I'd say to the young leaders out there on this call is when you get to be my age and you reflect back on your career, some of the guys that you thought were nice guys at the time, you got to realize they weren't nice guys. They were just weak.
Yeah.
And some of the guys you thought were total SOBs were really great leaders who cared enough to tell you the things you didn't want to hear.
Yeah, I agree with that. In fact, I try to be cute every now and then. I say that when it comes to leaders, sometimes there's two words that both start with N: nice and negligent.
Right.
And the nice leader, the guy that doesn't want to hurt anybody's feeling, more concerned about being nice than he is about your own development and survival. He may be a nice fella, but he's absolutely negligent in helping you succeed, which leadership obviously is all about.
And I'm sure, Mike, early in my career, especially as a leader, I was guilty of that.
Yeah. Well, we all were, Steve. I mean, and with the negligence and the inefficiencies, ineffectiveness, there's inexperience and unknowns and unintentional. And then there's the person that knows he's being negligent and says, I just know I should tighten this person up professionally and make sure that she's got everything necessary to remediate this. But on the chance that I'll hurt her feelings and she'll complain about me or talk trash about me, I'm just not going to do it. Will I have to fire her? Probably. If I was a real leader, I might be able to help her save herself. So I agree entirely. Last thoughts before we move on?
Well, just something you just said at the end I want to come back to, because this is one of the things where I think being a leader today in some ways is easier than it used to be, otherwise it's harder. But what you just touched on, in the last couple of companies I worked at, they were very aggressive about doing employee surveys and, do you like your boss? Do you have a good boss? Do you have a bad boss? All that. And one of the things that I think has made this worse or harder for some leaders is they're afraid to deliver that tough message to somebody. Because, oh boy, if I come down on them, they're going to kill me on my executive effectiveness surveys. You end up with this. We had one team that I had to fix at my last place, and it was clear as day once I spent some time with these guys. There's an unwritten deal here. I'm not going to manage you, and you're not going to do any work, and I won't tell on you, and you won't tell on me, and everybody will go home at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And again, what you have to help people understand is those teams fail. And when you fail, you're out anyway. So,
Yeah.
but you have to have the moral courage to tell people what they want to hear, whether they want to hear it or not.
Right. And I agree with that. Relative to these surveys, climate surveys or whatever the case may, I just tell people, be a good leader. The company's agenda should be your only agenda. And if someone complains about you for leading well and holding them accountable, and your boss takes a dim view of what you're doing, you probably need to start looking for a better job, because you're not working for a good leader yourself.
Well, that's exactly right. The other thing people don't realize, so we had these, we call them engagement scores, and you get 0 to 100. And there was this assumption, I think, on a lot of, especially youngers, that, okay, so I want to get a 98 or a 99 or whatever. But, that's not what the executive team was necessarily looking for.
Yeah.
And what we hated to see was an underperforming team and the leaders getting a 98 or 99. So the team's missing all their objectives, but they think their boss is the greatest guy in the world.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, okay. High number was not a good number.
Well, I agree. To a seasoned, savvy executive like you with some battle scars on your hide, underperforming unit, high marks from the people about their leader, that tells you something entirely different than that leader is probably interpreting it. Correct?
That's my point.
Exactly. And the whole genesis of this podcast is, if you could take that lesson, that thing you just said, those battle scars, if someone could have fed you that 40 years ago, think about how much easier certain things would have been.
What's the German expression? Too soon old, too late smart.
Yes, exactly. No, exactly. Well, listen, let's go to the other side of the coin. You've been around a long time, so I know you've seen some of the bottom end of the bell curve, defective. And I think, just much like the very best, I think that some of the most underperforming, very worst leaders, they also have some common traits and habits.
Absolutely.
And so I'd like you to expand upon that, Steve. What's your thoughts on that? What have you seen?
Well, first of all, I think sometimes my list of bad leaders, like, there's more ways to be good than there are ways to be bad. Like, I think there's definitely some common traits among my bad leaders. I'm going to start again with the most important characteristic, which is character. Now, by definition, if you are a person lacking character, moral courage, you're a bad leader, no matter how much you know about the subject matter, how well you write, how good you look, where you went to school, all that stuff. One of my assignments, I had a new direct report, and this guy had the same issue as that CEO who got fired in corporate America last week. And in our first meeting, and is well known in the company. And so he's introducing me, telling me what a great job he is and going to do, and give me the whole introductory speech. And when he says, "Do you have any questions?" I said, "Yeah, I just wanted to start. From what I understand, your wife can't trust you, so why should I?"
Yeah.
It went downhill quickly from there. So it starts with character, first of all.
Yeah.
Second thing, combination. Number one factor I've seen about ineffective leaders is everything's always all about them.
Yeah.
It's about their career, not yours, their promotion, their year-end bonus, their ego, how they look. One of the things that you brought to K-Force from your Marine days is you always said, the enlisted men eat first, leaders eat last. Yeah. For some of these corporate senior executives who I've seen who are not good, I'm not sure the employees ever eat. It's always about the leaders.
Yeah.
I remember getting a new boss early on in my career, and he gets appointed December 1st, and he's taking over in January. So he checks in with me in the middle of December, and he says, "How's it going?" I said, "I was going to give him good news." I said, "Mark, we're having a great December. We're finishing the year strong. And he's like, well, can't you save that business for next year? Because it wasn't going to impact his bonus. So he's like,
Yeah.
like,
Well,
wow.
what a red flag for you on that point,
Oh boy, he never recovered from that in my eyes.
No.
I think third thing I'd say is, how are they relative to the people who aren't in the room? One of my pet peeves is people who talk smack about who's ever not. So, as a leader, are they different when the boss is around? Are they talking stuff about other divisions, other people? To me, that kind of stuff is always a mark of low character. So if they're doing that to everybody else, I'm assuming they're doing it to me.
Yeah.
They focus on the wrong things. They're always worried about, instead, again, the mission, the people, the politics, how somebody's tying their tie, or just, who's just the politics, not the mission, not the people, everything else. Because the best leaders, that's where they spend all their time.
Yeah.
Some of the worst leaders, that's the last place they seem to spend it.
Yeah.
And I think two other things. One, afraid to act. So they don't have a bias for action. So there's always a reason to do another study, have a committee, just that they're afraid to take action. And again, they've been staring at the same damn problem for 5 years. And if they stand there for another 5, maybe it'll get absorbed into the environment or something. And then the last thing, they don't keep their commitments and follow through. And I think that is absolutely devastating. One of things I've always tried to do whenever I'm new to an organization, I'm trying to create the culture and get everything in place. I just, if I promise somebody something in a week, they get it in 3 days.
Yeah.
And it's just, you keep every commitment.
Yeah.
I went into the last place I was at. We had a new division I went into, and I did focus groups with all the employees to understand what was going on. And there was a woman, there had been there a long time. She was in an administrative position. She was an African-American woman, didn't have a lot of status in the organization. But she mentioned something. And I like, sometimes you hear something, that can't be right, but I heard it. And I checked and she was right. So within 24 hours, I fixed it and it went away. And she came into my office and she said, I can't believe you fixed that problem. That's been here for 10 years. And, I said, well, yeah, you articulated very clearly. It's obviously wrong. So it's gone. She said, well, I said it because I felt it, but it never occurred to me that an old white guy like you would listen to a young black woman like me and actually do something about it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And just following through on stuff like that can make a huge difference.
Yeah, I love that. I want to talk, go unscripted a bit here. We talked about trust, and your people have to trust you, and you have to trust that they're giving you the right information and all of that. And one anecdote that I use to teach this is the famous when Alan Mullally took over Ford. Mm-hmm. And on their executive teams, I'm sure you know what I'm about to say, they had like a red, yellow, green reporting system. And when he got there, the company had lost billions of dollars a year prior. And for the first few executive team meetings, it's all green.
Yep.
And so he got up, and you know what he did? He got up. I'm saying this for the audience. He got up and said, look, we're losing. We're essentially getting our ass kicked in the market, but you guys are all green. It can't be right. Tell me the truth. And they all sat there paralyzed. The next meeting, I think it was his South America guy came in and had a yellow light. And everybody was like, oh, gasped. Like, how's he going to react? And Mullally stood up and started clapping and said, thank you. Thank you for being honest. Now, what's your problem? He said, well, we're having problems getting a part. So that part, we're having trouble with the transmissions or whatever, and it's slowing the assembly line down. And he said he looked over to the supply guy and said, "Can you fix that, Fred?" He said, "Yes, it'll be fixed by the end of the week." And he said, "See," and so the next meeting, as you know, there were red lights, green lights, yellow lights. He just wanted the truth. And so I'm going to let you talk about it, because I find this a big deal, especially in sales organizations where, well, the numbers aren't where they're supposed to be, but I'll make them up by next week. So I'm essentially going to submit a false report to my boss, and I'm sure that you've received a few of those over your time. So the topic is, how does a leader, first of all, I say a leader must foster a culture where there's truth in reporting. And secondly, how does a leader do that, Steve?
Well, I couldn't agree more, Mike. And this goes back to the point I made when we talked about effective leaders, about establishing an environment where people can tell each other the truth. Because again, I go back to, IBM at the time, the most respected company in the world. But I used to joke that if the building ever caught on fire, everybody would burn to death at their desk, because it would be negative to admit that the building was on fire.
Yeah.
And so you're absolutely right. There's no niche in business today that isn't extraordinarily competitive, and not having accurate information of what's going on is the ultimate competitive disadvantage. So what you're saying is super true. I think that the leader has to do a couple things. One, everybody says, "Oh, bring me the truth, speak truth to power, tell me what's." Oh, I've never met a senior executive who didn't say that. Mm-hmm. But then, of course, the first time somebody does it, they rip their head off in a meeting.
Yeah.
I used to work for a guy who loved to talk stories about how he told truth to power. But when people did it to him, he'd get really pissed off.
Yeah.
So I think the first thing is you got to make it safe for people to tell you the truth.
Right.
And then the second thing is you got to do something with the information. Because if you make it safe, but nothing happens, like in your Mullally example, the guy brought the problem in, Mullally, said good, but then he took action. Hey, Fred, fix it. And so it solved the problem.
Yes.
So people are going to speak up when they know it's safe to speak up and when it results in tangible benefit.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree entirely. I agree. Well, let's take a different twist here. Let's talk about, I'm big, as you know, on the importance, especially for the younger folks, Steve, of getting, everybody I think has role models, but few have mentors and coaches.
Yep.
And those can be on a formal and an informal basis. And I'm sure you had role models. Most of us do. Teddy Roosevelt was one of my role models. Well, I didn't get a chance to talk to Teddy. So, he was a role model, but I'm never going to get mentored by him. What are your thoughts? What's your advice, especially to the younger people? I think a lot of people, and I'm talking 20s, 30s, maybe even 40s, early 40s, are like, I'll do that later. And I maintain, no. Seek mentorship, seek multiple mentors, seek coaches, pay for it if you have to, if you can, within your means, but get help as early as possible. Your thoughts?
Well, I'd agree with that. And I think it starts with something I know you believe in, is that ultimately anybody who commits to the journey toward becoming a great leader, first, that starts with taking ownership of your own development as a leader.
Yeah, yes.
It's not something that the company owes you, although smart companies do. But it first and foremost, I'm responsible for my own development as a leader. So you start there. Because I spent most of my career at the same company, other than IBM, I spent the next 30 years at the same place. It was a pretty homogeneous environment for a lot of those years. And I was surrounded with a lot of people who were just like me, other salespeople. What I found, I got some of my best mentorship is later on, where I worked with people who weren't like me. So you and I had the same boss for one point, the last, I think, 8 or 9 years I worked there. He was unlike anybody else I had ever worked for there. Mm. And what I learned is you learn the most sometimes from the people who are least like you. And sometimes the relationships are the least comfortable.
Right.
And then you came in from the outside, bringing a totally different perspective, unlike I had everything. So I learned a tremendous amount from you. So I think, first of all, you got to own it. I think you have to be proactive in seeking them out. And I would encourage people to in every company, there's that leader who's known as being great at developing people. And people who work for this guy or gal then go on to do great things in that company. If you can latch on to that person,
Yeah.
Late in my career, I got that reputation of being that guy, and people would come to me and say, "Hey, Steve, I know there's this formal leadership thing in the company, but like, I watched it." And so I had several unofficial mentoring relationships. HR knew nothing about them.
Yeah.
People arranged them themselves. They've been proactive.
Yeah.
And the other thing I'd say is if you're in a company, so I say this I have 3 kids who are 2, 6, and 10 years into their careers. And one of the things I've always told them is that, look, if you're the smartest person in the room, you're in the room.
Yeah.
And they've all had the good fortune of getting good bosses early in your career. And the earlier in your career, you can work for a great boss.
Yeah.
That's like a force multiplier over the rest of your life.
No doubt.
And sometimes it's luck. You just get a good one. Sometimes you have to make it happen and maneuver inside a company. And my son just moved in his company, and it's not always moving up. It's not always getting more, stuff like title, money. I find a lot of younger people, they're focused on the wrong stuff. How much money you make when you're 28 years old, or what your title is, that's going to have immaterial impact on the rest of your life.
Yeah.
It's what you learned how to do. It's the skills you developed. And finally, I'd say, if you're in a place and you don't see people that you can learn from and you should be emulating, you need to think long and hard about whether you're in the right place.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. And I to your point, I think a lot of the younger folks can be short-sighted. And to their defense, they're young, they're just married, They got mortgages, they got babies and all of that. What I tell people is that if there's 2 places in corporate America you can make a lot of money. Sales. If you're selling the right product and you're really good at it, you can make a ton of money, as you know. The next big niche is if you can lead. If you can lead and get, no matter what your resume, your pedigree is, if you have a history, a resume of being injected into situations, and for whatever reason, this guy or gal makes it work, you are going to make a lot of money if you want to. Because
that's right. Because as we said earlier, there's so few great leaders.
Yes.
And, you read a lot now about whether it's, harder for young, this and that. There's always room at the top. There's always room. If you can sell, if you can lead, there isn't a company on earth that has enough good salespeople and even more, enough good leaders. If you have those skills, they got room for you, I promise.
Yeah, I want to share an anecdote here, Steve, that you're unaware of it. I've told very few people this, and it may seem a little bit self-serving, but it's for the benefit of the audience. You've alluded to it, you've mentioned it, as you know, and some of the audience knows, I had no technology background whatsoever.
Yep.
And I got a call one night from our boss, and he said, "Mike, we want you, we just fired the CIO. We want you to take over the company's internal IT department."
I was there. Yeah.
which you and I both were customers of, and you know it. They were not good. We didn't have a good IT department, loaded full of good people.
Yeah.
But they just failed at everything they did. And so I jumped at it. And I realized, and people set me up for success. And what they needed was less of a technical leader and more of a leader and an organizer. Yep. And the bar was very low. The bar was very, very low. So anybody that could execute basic leadership was going to succeed in that role. Here's what I'm getting at. We took, and I say we, that team took arguably, without argue, clearly the worst back office department in the company, by far the worst. And I would say within 2 years, certainly within 3, or without a doubt, it was the best.
Yeah.
We turned the biggest liability of the back office into an afterthought. It was an afterthought that we were going to put software implementation. We did it well. We did it exceptionally well. So here's where I'm going with this. After several years in that role, I get a call one day from a headhunter at my desk. He's got the phone and he says, Mike, I'm Joe Smith from whatever company. I'm representing a client and they're very interested in you. And they want to know if you have an interest in coming over and being their CIO. And he said, I can't tell you who they are, but I can tell you it's a big company. It's a big company. And someone that you've worked with works there. And they said, you're the guy. And I'm like, look, I appreciate it. And here's the meat of it, Steve. And for the leaders listening. And I said, look, I am flattered, but they're not looking for me. I'm not a technical guy. I mean, I'm here, but I'm not a technical guy. I'm not this, I'm not that, I'm not this. And the guy said, oh no, Mike, we are absolutely looking for you. Correct me if I'm wrong. And the guy started listing my resume. You inherited this, you did this, your team has accomplished this, you've done this, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, well, that's all true. He said, I have been directed by the principal we're representing. He said, I am tired of technicians with master's degrees that know their stuff technically, but they cannot lead IT departments. Find me a leader, ideally a leader who has proven that he can successfully organize and lead an IT department. And the headhunter said, Mike, do you agree that that's you? And I said, well, now that you mention it, yes, that is me. It is me. And I said, look, I'll be honest with you. I am flattered. I'm not interested. So I didn't pursue it anymore. But I hung up that call, Steve, realizing that just by leading well, that my reputation as a leader who was able to go in and influence organizations that I had no training or expertise in the subject matter, that leadership really was an incredibly marketable skill. Because obviously, I was doing well, making good money there. They weren't expecting me to leave at the same salary. It would have been a significant bump and all that. I wasn't interested. I loved where we were at. So I want to let you talk right now. But I mean, they were not after me for my good looks, obviously. They were after me for leadership ability. Your thoughts?
Well, it goes back to what we were saying before, Mike. It may be the commodity most lacking in corporate America today.
I agree.
You can find lots of people that know finance or computers or marketing or whatever. But because it's hard, because it's you just can't go to school for a couple of years, take a bunch of courses, master it. It's a journey. You have to do hard things like telling people what they don't want to hear, pushing people out of their comfort zones. It's not easy.
Yeah.
And because there aren't a lot of role models that are found, I mean, I sound like a cranky old man now, which I guess I should, because that's probably what I am. But like if you're a young person right now, and you look out and you survey 2023 America, and you say, okay, so off the top of your head, who are the 5 great leaders you see influencing society today?
Yeah.
Could anybody pick 5?
Yeah.
How about 2? 1? I mean, just
Yeah.
so it's a scarce commodity, and companies will always pay for what's hardest to get. I don't think there's anything more impactful or harder to get than a great leader.
I agree entirely. In fact, I tell people, and I wrote it in my book, I like most young kids, I wished I could be a professional athlete.
Right.
Well, that wasn't in the cards. I wasn't tall. I wasn't fast. I wasn't good looking. You know what I mean? So there went the acting career as well. But I was a professional warrior, and I realized that took study and all of that. And then I realized, I never achieved a goal of being a professional athlete. It just wasn't in the cards. But I was a professional leader, right, in the best sense. And I'm going to let you talk on this. I encourage leaders listening to this that don't confine yourself to being an IT leader or a finance leader or an HR leader elevate and become a professional leader, because I make this bold statement, Steve, that I am at the level, and I believe you're there too, that I am confident that you can inject me in any organization of any size, and I can help make things better right off the bat, just by the questions I know to ask, the things I know to do, and all of that. Now, there'll be a time in the future where I need some technical competence, but I always say, you put me in charge of General Motors, and I can make General Motors better quickly in the short term, because maybe there's not truth in reporting and all that. And that's the mark of a professional leader. So I flatter myself. And then I say, at some point, you really do need an automotive executive to lead General Motors. But for that 60 or 90-day period, people say, be darned, the he's slayed some sacred dragons here, So your thoughts, your thoughts on helping young leaders view themselves to this as a professional leader, and the battlefield out there is largely empty of qualified leaders that can be plugged into industries and companies and levels, that are varied and abound. Your thoughts?
No, I think that's absolutely right. These companies are all loaded with subject matter expertise. General Motors has thousands of people that know automotive, or pick your company. It's usually not the issue. That's not, if they're not succeeding, that's not why.
Yeah.
It's more the eternal things we're talking about now in terms of leadership and direction, development of people, and that's not industry dependent.
Yeah,
it just isn't.
Yeah.
I think, and I started in technology, then staffing for technology, then healthcare, finance along the way. Every industry is usually convinced that their industry is uniquely complex. And, when I worked for IBM, I had clients in every industry you could imagine. Every one of them thought theirs was the hardest, the most complex. It's the same stuff in every place.
Yeah.
It's just, it's like weightlifting. It's not easy, but nobody ever stopped doing it because they couldn't figure it out.
I agree with that. Until my earlier comments, Steve, I think you just agreed with me. Leadership is all about humans, human nature. And no matter what the company's product, service, expertise is, it's staffed with human beings.
Right.
And so if our listeners can realize that the leadership that is required of somebody in IBM, a small $2 million company, the government, or whatever the case, leadership is leadership. And if you master the fundamentals, to your point, if you know how to train the muscles, so to speak, you're going to be successful. And I encourage people to cast a broad vision of leadership, a broad vision, knowing that, hey, I'm here now at the age of 33. At 48, I could be in an entirely different industry doing well as a leader.
Well, I agree with that. In fact, I think that vision goes two ways. I think on one hand, people sometimes put artificial limits on themselves, and I think that's what you're speaking to.
Yes.
But I also think the reverse is true. I think oftentimes as people progress in leadership, they think that as they're developing leaders, selecting leaders, hiring leaders, they need to find people just like them.
Yeah.
And that's, I started, as I said, at IBM, which had a very defined perspective on what a leader looked like, acted like, spoke like, dressed like. And it took me for a long time to realize how misplaced that was.
Mm.
And you see that in corporate America, where the guy who was a fraternity guy only hires fraternity guys. The guy who was a jock only hires jocks. You came into our organization, and if you're going to work in the finance organization, you had to be a CPA, because if you didn't want a CPA, you couldn't possibly do what you did.
I remember that. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think that cuts both ways.
Yeah.
And What I've learned over time is it's not about where they went to school. It's not about where they buy their suits. It's all not. It just isn't about that stuff. It's about a very different set of skills, and those are the skills and attributes and attitudes that define a professional leader.
Yeah, there's no doubt about it. Well, we're running out of time, but I have to ask you this question. So you did, assuming that a lot of our listeners want to become senior executives, C-level executives, you did that several times, Steve. You'd been there, done that. Knowing, and I don't know, I'll let you talk. I don't know if you aspired to that in your 20s or 30s, aspired to be a C-level guy somewhere, but you certainly ended up there and did it well. Relative to becoming an executive leader, senior level leader, what advice would you now give to the 28-year-old Steve McMahan?
Well, I think a couple things, most of which were touched on. I'll finish with one thing we haven't touched on. I think if you go to work every day and you behave with unquestioned character at all times, and I know I'm a broken record on this, but I've just seen so many people derail themselves on this, Mike.
Yeah.
So number one, it's your character. Number two, it's about the mission and the people. It's not about you, it's about me. I think sometimes the guys who focus most on themselves and their next promotion, their next raise, they're the ones who spend their whole career spinning their wheels in corporate America and never get anywhere.
Yeah.
So it's about the mission. It's about the people. It's understanding what your leadership is trying to achieve. It's about getting the right results, but it's also about getting the right results the right way.
Yeah.
Because I do think the higher up you go, it's less about how much you know and more about, can you collaborate? Like, you've been in the C-suite. Like, the guys who get bounced out the fastest are the ones who just can't collaborate effectively with this.
Yeah.
Are you the kind of leader where you've got this young man or young woman, you've developing them for 10 years and you're grooming for the success, and then a peer leader elsewhere in the organization needs somebody? Well, do you sit on your person because you need them, or do you give up that person for the betterment of the organization?
Yes.
So really, again, it's about everything we've talked about, and then I'll add this one other thing, and I think it's also important that you find a place that's right for you.
Mm-hmm.
The Marine Corps today, from what I read, is a very, very different organization in some ways than the one you've got.
Without a doubt.
My guess is the Mike E. Tour of the 1970s and 80s might not be as good a fit for the Marine Corps of today as he was then.
Probably so.
Yeah. And I know I had an experience after, can I go on a couple minutes on this?
Yes, okay. Please.
So after I left the company we worked together for so many years, I was recruited in by their president of North America and a board member to go to a company. And it's a very good company. One of the largest companies in the world. They did business in 54 countries. And I was brought in to fix a division that on a percentage basis had lost more money than any division in any company in the world. It was great people. They were a little unlucky. They were in the wrong market during the bad recession, 2008, 9, 10, that area. And I went in and good timing, good people, did some good things. And a couple of years in, I had had tremendous success. And so we gathered at a meeting, a president's meeting, and my boss and head of North America, and all the presidents there. I'm one of a dozen presidents. And he basically held me up as a role model. Said, this guy's newer here than most of you, but if you ever want to know I was probably older than a lot of them because I was old by then. And he basically said that this is how you be a president. Well, a few months later, he got pushed out, and his arch rival from another part of the world was brought in. It turned out these people hated each other's guts. Mm-hmm. And the first time I met with this new leader, She made it pretty clear that she didn't think much of me at all. And I'm like, wait a minute, call the last guy. He thought I was great. And what I learned there, I hadn't become incompetent in 90 days. I was quite confident. Its beauty is really in the eye of the beholder.
Yes.
And so I tried to make that work for a couple of years and just beat my head against that wall. Partly for political reasons. Turns out I had been hired over her objections. She had been her lieutenant. She had, for a million different reasons, most of which had nothing to do with me. She didn't like me, didn't appreciate me, didn't think I was any good. So I decided to leave, and I had 2 job offers, and I went to the one that paid less money and required me to uproot my family. But I felt I really fit there, and that they were just like, I was what they wanted, and they weren't going to try and change me. And so the first day on the job, I'm out in this company's headquarters in Salt Lake City, having lunch with my boss, and I said, "So, Alan, what advice do you have for me?" He said, "Steve, this company's 40 years old. We've never hired somebody at your level from the outside. You are the most scrutinized hire in the history of this company. 19 people interviewed." And he said, "The thing people here at this company are going to appreciate most about you is the thing your last boss hated most about you. So you just come in here and be yourself, and you're just going to do so well here."
Yeah.
And that's exactly what happened. So some of the, like, we've talked about character and work ethic and all this, and these are eternal verities. But the other thing is if fit matters.
It does.
And so if you don't see people, if you're a young leader, this is what I'm getting at. Sorry to be so long.
Nope.
And if you look up, if you don't see, I want to be like her, I want to be like him. I see people here I admire, respect, trust. If you don't see that, you're probably in the wrong place.
I agree. I agree entirely. Fit does matter. In fact, our boss, had a significant finance and banking background.
Yep.
And he told me one day, he said, "Mike, in my previous industry, you wouldn't make it." And I'm like, "Interesting. Tell me why." He said, "Listen, I learned the hard way that in high-level banking, you're probably not going to believe this, but I'm here to tell you." He said, "Do you trust people here? Do you trust your peers?" I said, "Yes, absolutely. I have never had a thought that anybody was trying to stab me in the back or prosper at my expense." He said, "Listen, where I came from, you had to assume everybody was trying to screw you." And I'm like, "Really?" He said, "Yes, Mike, I tell you, I've been cheated at the last minute out of $1 million commissions. I've been stabbed in the back. I've had put ideas, deals together, only to come in overnight and realize it's been stolen from me by someone in the company. And I had to assume that in that industry, people were out for numero uno. And if they had to run over me to make money, they were going to do it." And I'm like, "Well, I got to be honest with you. I wouldn't make it because I don't want to go to work every day wondering who is trying to destroy me or lie to me or climb over me. I don't want to operate in an environment like that."
Exactly my point.
And my point, and the further thing that I will reinforce, and I think you'll agree with, I'll let you speak to it. I tell young people, save some money so that when you find but when you find yourself in an environment that's not a good fit for various reasons, that you have the ability to voluntarily leave without worrying where next month's mortgage payment is coming from. Have enough of a cushion to where you could say, "I can't take it anymore." In fact, not only did they not want truth in reporting, my boss is requiring me to lie on sales reports every week. Yeah. You need to have the financial resources, and it's not all that much, to be able to leave that company. Otherwise, if you're financially barren and you're forced to stay, then you're in an environment that you hate. So I'm saying a couple of different things here. I agree with you on fit. I think it's the onus is on the individual to realize they are not a good fit, and that every day they stay in there is, a force multiplier in the negative. And the way that they can leave quickly is if they have the financial ability to do it. And I'm talking 3 months, 5 months, 6 months worth of saving. The things that competent financial planners advise young folks or anybody to have. If you have that, it's easier to say, you know what, it's been fun. I'm out of here. And I don't have a job yet. Your thoughts?
Well, that's great advice, Mike, on multiple levels. Early on, back when I got into sales, 40 something years ago, the mindset was they wanted you in debt up to your ears because then they controlled you. You couldn't.
Yes.
And I never preached that. I tell my kids, your only security is your own ability to stand on your own. And so you want to have skills that makes you marketable, and you want to have walkaway power. So that is wonderful advice because there will come a point in the world we live in where somebody's just going to find themselves in the wrong place. And that's maybe the other big takeaway as I reflect back. No matter if you do everything right, at some point you're going to get kicked in the teeth and you're going to get knocked down. You're going to get blamed for something you didn't do, or maybe you did do, or just over the course of a career. And it's a cliche, but it's true. It's not how many times you get knocked down. It's how many times you get up.
Yes.
And part of that is just having the gumption and the backbone, but part of it is just financially to be in a position where you have walkaway power if you find yourself in the wrong circumstances.
Yeah, I agree. Well, before we let you out of here, Steve, I have to ask you the classic question. If you were able to bring back one leader from the past and spend a day with that person, who would it be and why?
So, Mike, I listened to a lot of your podcasts, so I knew you were going to ask me this question. And we scheduled this weeks ago, as you know, and I spent a lot of time thinking about this, and I went through a long list. I'm like, okay, well, I'm going to come up with somebody no one else has come up with, or this or that. But what I'm going to answer is very uncreative, and I apologize for that. But I've got 3 kids. Eventually, they're probably going to have their kids, and I've had a wonderful life and been privileged to grow up in a great country. But when I look out today, I'm very, very concerned about the trajectory of our great country and society. Yeah. I think it's just like people say, "No, don't you wish you were 25?" No. I'm very happy to have grown up when I grew up. And I think the last time our country was in this much trouble was probably in the years before the Civil War.
Yeah, I agree.
So I would pick Abraham Lincoln because he is the last person who led this country successfully when it was as divided and discontent as it is today.
Yeah, great choice. Well, yes, I can't top that. I mean, Abraham Lincoln, as you know, was a uniter and had his work cut out for him, and also had the technique of bringing in the people who disagreed with him the most critical of him, bringing them in and leveraging and putting them in positions of power. And so now the onus was on them to make things work too, as well.
Team of rivals. Yep.
Smart guy, very smart guy. Well, listen, Steve, I can't thank you enough. I think some people are going to listen to this, maybe some of your old colleagues. Somebody needs to get in touch with you. How do they get in touch with you? LinkedIn, or how can they find you?
Yeah, LinkedIn's the easiest way. I'm still on there. I hear from people all the time. I'm for the most part retired, but I'm still around. And anybody on a leadership journey, especially young people on a leadership journey, I wouldn't have gotten to where I've gotten to in my life without a lot of people who helped me. You're certainly one of them. And I think you always got to pay that back. So I'm always here if I can help a young leader develop.
Well, I agree with that. Thank you. And by the way, I've learned so much from you as well, Steve. And for what it's worth, I don't know if I've ever told you this, but as you know, early on when I joined the company and was bringing a lot of Marines in, not everybody was a fan of that. And you were an early adopter, so to speak. So we always knew that we had a friend and ally in Steve McMahan. And I can't thank you enough for that. You got a lot of young folks off to a smooth start in the company and in the business world. And I know they're always grateful for that. So
Well, they were
thank you
great
for that.
Americans. I'm glad to have done it.
Yeah, they were. Well, listen, Steve, thank you so much for this. Selfishly, I humbly request that you consider coming back for another episode.
Always here for you, Mike. I owe you so much.
Thank you so much, Steve. Have a great day.
Take care. Bye.
We hope you've enjoyed this podcast. Please subscribe, rate, review, and recommend to your friends. Please visit our website at fidelisleadership.com and sign up for our leadership newsletter. Until next time, remember the words of the ancient Greek philosopher Pericles.
What you leave behind is not what is engraved in stone monuments, but is woven in the lives of others.